If you want to make beats that sound like they came from an MPC, you don't need to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on an actual MPC. You can make these kinds of beats right now no matter what you use, and today I'm going to show you how. So you heard the beat in the intro, let's go over how this was made. I started with what's probably the most important part in getting your beats to sound like this, which are the drums. And I'll show you how I made this drum loop by recreating it from scratch. But first, it would really help me out if you hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, so if you find my videos helpful, please do me a favor and hit those buttons. So first what I did was I looked for a kick. I wanted one that didn't have as much color, so I avoided kicks like this. And instead I chose this kick. Notice the difference in the higher frequencies. These types of beats typically have less presence in the high end, so I wanted to avoid using brighter sounds. This kick came from a Beat Batter Pack Mutant drums. This video isn't sponsored or anything. These are just my go-to drums when I want to make these kinds of beats, so I just thought I'd share. Next up, I added Saturn and Camel Crusher, and I also used an EQ and made a boost around 100 Hz. All of this was to help add more thump to the kick. Next up was the snare, and this is the one that I eventually chose here, which actually comes from a sample. Using snares from sampled drum breaks like this can be a great choice because of the natural reverb on them. I'll show you just how important this is later on in this video though. For now, let's process this snare using Redopter. I mentioned this plugin before. It's really useful for recoloring your snares. This preset here is what I settled on, and you can see why if I open up an EQ. Here's a snare without Redopter, and here's a snare with Redopter. It's narrowing how much frequency space the snare takes up, and most importantly, it reduces the brightest frequencies, which is exactly what I want. Next up, a great way to add detail into your drum break is by using a secondary snare. This is also why snares that come from a drum break can be so valuable. You often get multiple snares that you can choose from that have a slightly different tonality, yet a similar overall aesthetic. And by using multiple snares, your drum loop will start to sound more detailed. For my pattern, I'm going to show you yet another helpful trick. First, I'll simply put notes on the 2 and the 4 with my primary snare, nothing too special here. But for our secondary snare, instead of simply programming ghost notes like this, what I like to do sometimes is stack multiple ghost snares on top of each other. And if I want to introduce differing tonality throughout the drum loop, I'll either remove layers or change the pitch. You can hear the slight difference in tonality between these two sections, for example. Another trick that I like to do is adding a ghost snare where some of the kicks hit. So let's put a kick on the 1, for example. Now if I add a ghost snare at the exact same time as this kick, it helps create a cohesion between my snare and my kick by coloring the kick to sound closer to what the snare sounds like. This is just a little trick that you can try. And with this pattern, you can also see that I'm using the common techniques such as controlling velocity, as well as not having notes play with the exact timing on grid. So now the snare patterns are complete. Next, I'll add in more kicks to help my drum loop sound more full. One small tip I want to point out, I programmed these kicks at a different pitch. I didn't just use the pitch that the samples came in. This is something that you might want to do, especially if your drums aren't from the same loop and they're from different sources like mine are. Next, let's introduce the hi-hats. I found this hi-hat from yet another drum break. It's pretty bright, as you can hear, so processing is needed. I used Reels, which is a tape emulation plugin. This can be used to quickly and easily remove brighter frequencies and saturate your sound for that rougher feel. Now for a hi-hat pattern, in prior videos I talked about how programming a consistent hi-hat velocity was a common and typical approach to making that more classic boom bap from the 90s. This time though, I'll show you a different approach where the hi-hats are a lot more subdued if you prefer this style. So instead of creating a pattern that has a dominant, steady, loud hi-hat, I created pockets where the hi-hats are loud and other pockets where the hi-hats almost vanish. It's just a different groove based on whatever you want to make. Now for the final step for my drums, which is parallel processing. Here's how the drum loop sounds right now. And here is what we get once we do this last step. As you can tell, this is a very useful step. What you want to do is take all of your drum sounds and route them to a new mixer insert. And in this new mixer insert, you want to add effects that will help introduce and change the character of your drums. For this beat, I used Decapitator, which is such a helpful tool for your drums and your bass. Then I added a transient processor and turned up the release. And this is why I chose this specific snare. This tool helps accentuate the reverb that's on your snare and making it sound much larger. And you can hear what happens if I used a dry snare that has no reverb on it instead. Our drum pattern doesn't sound quite as full. So whether you use a snare that has reverb on it or you just add your own reverb onto it yourself, you can use this technique to help your drum loops. After this, I added Decimort, which is yet another tool for recoloring. And so after that, here's our final drum loop. So the drums are done. All that's left is my sample and my bass for this beat. To find a sample, I simply searched Fender Rhodes Jazz Sample. This is the sample that I settled on, and I'll explain why this sample was so perfect in a second. Now before I chop the sample up, let's first process it. Effect number 1 is reels. This degraded the sample, introduced some harshness, but also introduces some fluttering and wobbles. This emulates sampling from a vinyl record, one that might have some slight warping on it. After this, I added Decimort. This is primarily to introduce more noise into the high end. Now you might be wondering, why am I introducing high-end presence into my beat, even though earlier in this video I said that these beats typically don't have much presence in the high end. The reason why is because you will need some presence in the high end, otherwise your beat will sound flat and dead. But how you do this will make a difference. With these kinds of beats, it can help introduce high end by using noise and static and distortion rather than an actual instrument that sits in the high end. That way our beats sound full, but we still maintain that rough, low-grade aesthetic. The amount of noise that Decimort added here was a bit excessive though, so what I did next was I EQ'd it to get a better balance. Now to chop the sample up and create a loop. I let Serato Sample create chops for me, and I looked through its automated chops to find something that sounded good just as a starting point. That last chop there sounded good as a starting point. All I need to do is adjust and stretch it. And this is why I like this sample. Typically when I look for a song to sample, there might be a section from the song that jumps out to me that I want to make a beat out of. But this sample is pretty much a 2-minute long Fender Rhodes solo. The whole thing is open to being sampled, offering up far more flexibility. In this situation, I'm open to any idea that I might stumble upon. So here's the loop that I came up with. But the tail end of it sounded a bit awkward and uninteresting, so I duplicated the sample out and found other notes from the sample to layer on top to improve our loop. This sounded much better. Next, I introduced the bass, which really helped fill up space in the beat, and I chose an upright bass, which is a common jazz bass, helping me fit the aesthetic that I'm going for here. This bass came from Complete Start, which is free to download. A link to that is in the description box below in case you want some free stuff. And like I mentioned before, adding Decapitator on your bass is really helpful, which is exactly what I did along some EQing to make this a heavy low-end bass. And now it's time to program a bass line. From here, I didn't want to add many more new layers. These beats typically have a minimal feel to them, so adding in more sounds and instruments takes away from that stripped down, raw feeling these beats typically have. But to help this beat from becoming monotonous, I created some additional variations using the sample. Then I did this exact same thing again, but this time I changed the bass line, removed my snare, and threw some horns onto this. This way we have 3 different sections for our beat. And I was able to make this many variations just because the sample offered up so much flexibility and material to use. So by implementing all of what I've just shown you, making beats that sound like they came from an old school MPC should now be easier. But if you want to watch a tutorial on how to make a similar style of beat but with a more modern sound and aesthetic, like a Griselda or Alchemist style of beat, check out the video next to me. In it, I show you lots of different helpful tips and tricks that you can apply if you like this sound but want a more modern variation of it. So yeah, go ahead and check that video out, and hopefully you're having a good day, and I hope you enjoyed this video.